So many of you were with us last night over at Temple Beth Ami, and there was a surprise guest. Now, everybody, of course, asked me this morning, are there any surprises today? And I don't know. I don't have any planned, but you never know. There can be other surprises. Maybe you'll surprise yourself. I don't know. But for those who were not here last night or have not seen this, because you actually can go on and watch this. Congressman Mike Garcia came to Temple Beth Ami last night to deliver an apology, and it was about 4.5 minutes. I know that because it's up on our TBA YouTube channel, which you may not know that TBA has a YouTube channel, but we do now. There's actually hundreds of videos up on the TBA YouTube, including our Shabbat services and Torah studies, and we archive everything up there. It's nothing, I think it's all entertaining and all PG or G rated, but you can actually watch it anywhere you want to, on your phone, on your computer, on your TV. And the Garcia the Garcia apology was an interesting apology. People, of course, a lot of people asked me what was the reaction to it, what did people say. I was interested to hear what my daughters had to say. They gave me an earful when I got home. And it was interesting to hear what the reaction was to it. But what was really important about it was not the reaction that people had to what he said, actually, because that wasn't the purpose of it. And it wasn't, as I said, to do any kind of political endorsement or trying to change anyone's minds, because as I said, probably 97% of us already have our minds made up. But why we did it, and why I share an example every year, this one just happened to be able to be right in front of you and live, is because this time of year, and specifically at Yom Kippur, today, we're supposed to think about how we can apologize. So that was an example of an apology. And think about it, watch it again, or watch it for the first time and decide for yourself, was this an acceptable apology? Did it meet the criteria that we understand as what's needed to do an apology? So that was what it was there for. It was there as an example, a living example of how to make an apology, how maybe not to make an apology. You decide. And there was another really important lesson last night, which I hope you caught, and if you didn't, you know that Mike Garcia now was there last night to apologize. A sitting U.S. congressman took time to be there. That by itself, some people said, took courage or is something to recognize. I don't know. Some people said maybe he wants to get votes. I don't know. But I want to tell you, that's not why he was there. He was there to also teach us that no one is above needing to make an apology. There is no person on this planet who is of such stature, or such importance, or such power that they don't have to make an apology. And that was what last night was all about. Making sure that you know that. Because if somebody doesn't have to make an apology because of their power, their wealth, then who's to decide where that stops? Because you can always say, I don't need to give that person an apology. They're not as powerful or as important or as wealthy as me. And so it never ends. No one would get or receive an apology. Or give an apology to who? I don't know. So that was one of the most important lessons for last night, is that everybody is held accountable. Now, I admit it was tough because it was a public apology, and if you weren't there, but you've heard a public apology before, everyone's heard public apologies, they're tough because it's very hard, if not impossible, to apologize to a group of people, to more than one person, because everybody has been affected in a slightly different way. And so you can't exactly address everyone's grievance by a public apology if you've hurt more than one person. So by nature, that's a little difficult. So that's also something to consider. But here's maybe the most important part of it. That was an exercise for about Well, I'm not sure, but I'm guessing pretty close to about 85% of the people that were there last night. I made it real hard for you. I know that. Because I want you to ask yourselves a question. Do you want to forgive someone? Do you actually want to give forgiveness? So I'm going to take you back, not last week or last month, but I'm going to take you back thousands of years ago to Genesis. And I love the book of Genesis. I always say this is my favorite book of the Bible. Every book is. But no, Genesis is really unique. It's very special. And most of us, when we think about Genesis, we think about that word. We think about the beginning, the first chapter, one chapter, which is the creation of the universe. And by the way, some people dismiss the entire book or the entire Bible because they don't like the story of creation. They think it's literal. They think it's got, this is all craziness. This is mythology. It's one chapter. The rest of the book of Genesis, 99% of it is about family. It should actually be called family. And it's all about family relationships. It's not really about creation. The very first relationship that we read about is the relationship between Adam and Eve, the very first two people. And guess what? Not a great relationship. It's kind of dysfunctional right from the beginning. That's chapter 2. And in chapter 3, we have the next relationship, which is the relationship of siblings, which, if you haven't read the story of Cain and Abel, I'm going to ruin it for you. Cain kills Abel. The first brothers one of them ends up killing the other, which when you think about it is astounding because it tells you that, sibling rivalry is not only real, but the potential is there for someone to kill somebody in their own family. Which of course means that if a brother can kill another brother, then all bets are off. Anyone can kill anyone. It's a scary thought. But it also reminds us that our relationships begin in our family and oftentimes begin with our sibling relationships. And that's really the focus of the rest of the book of Genesis. Primarily sibling relationships, but also relationships between a father and a son, a mother and a son. Most of them are men or boys. We read about one last week, the Abraham and Isaac story, right? A father and a son. But the siblings are the big ones. And so we start with Cain and Abel, and then by chapter 37, we get to the story of Joseph. So chapter 37, we're introduced to Joseph and his brothers. And you've seen Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. You know what happens. It's an amazing story. But consider for a fact that that's chapter 37, and the book of Genesis ends in chapter 50, which means that 13 chapters of the book of Genesis are devoted just to Joseph and his family, and his brothers. And actually, if you go back, the story of Jacob and his brother Esau, which is also a very dysfunctional family relationship that includes the parents too, right? That begins in chapter 26. So if Genesis is 50 chapters long, 26 through 50 are Jacob and Joseph. It means half the book of Genesis is about those relationships. That's the majority, or at least half of the book is just about that family. So think about it if it was a movie. I mean, most of the movie is about that relationship. And so Jacob and Esau have a very dysfunctional relationship. One of them almost kills the other, threatens to kill the other one for sure. Actually says that. And what's special about it is by the time, just before we meet Joseph, literally the chapters before, Jacob and Esau reconcile. And Esau forgives Jacob for stealing the birthright and the blessing. But they don't end up living together. And so then we get into the story of Joseph, which is really, as beautiful as some of the songs are in Joseph, there's a point which he kind of gets obscured in most tellings of Joseph, which is that the brothers actually try to kill Joseph. They actually throw him in the pit, and they say they're going to kill him. That's what they say. And they act on it. They almost do it. It's Reuben who says, I'm going to come back and get my brother, and he doesn't have a chance to. And then also Judah, who decides, well, let's sell him instead. Let's sell him into slavery. And that's the way that Joseph gets saved by being sold as a slave and winds up being a prisoner and winds up spending 20 years of his life from the time he's 17 till about the time he's 40 being a slave and being in jail. I mean, think about if you had spent 20 years of your, arguably some of the best parts of your life, in jail and as a slave. So, some of this gets obscured in the tellings of this, how powerful that is. I mean, it's overwhelming to me to think about what I'd be like if I was Joseph. And so then we get to the very last chapter of the book of Genesis, which is where Joseph has now brought his family down. He's risen to being number 2 in Egypt, if you recall. He's second only to Pharaoh, which means that at the time, he's the second most powerful man in the world, because Egypt was the most powerful country without question at the time. I mean, literally, the pyramids are already 2,000 years old by that point. I mean, most of the world 3,200 years ago is still living kind of like cave people, at least almost all, basically all of Europe. But in this one part of North Africa, literally we still think that maybe aliens came and helped these people because they're so far advanced. And Joseph, according to the Torah, is second only to Pharaoh. And so there's no one more powerful. He's not the vice president, by the way, because as you know from Veep, the vice president doesn't do anything. He's actually the power behind the throne. He's actually the one who makes the decisions, tells Pharaoh what to do. And so he's reconciled with his brothers. He's brought them down. They've come down because they needed food. He reveals who he is. He invites his brothers to come and make a home for them in Egypt, saves their lives, brings his father down. And the Torah tells us, as I said, 13 chapters. There's a lot of information here. By the way, what's not in the Torah? Joseph had many, many years to try to find his father, to try to find his brothers. He doesn't do it. The Torah doesn't say why, but think about that for a second. Write that midrash. Figure out that explanation. Joseph is the most powerful, second most powerful in the world, has at his disposal messengers and slaves and horses and everything. He doesn't make one attempt to try to find his father, to let his father know he's okay. So it's very possible that Joseph has kind of left that part of his life behind him and doesn't want to think about Canaan anymore. Because he could have. He didn't. So when he's finally reconciled and his brothers are living under his protection, in chapter 50, at the end of the last chapter, this is literally the last verses of Genesis, their father Jacob dies. And immediately after Jacob dies, and people who study this with Torah with me know this, but most people don't know that this is in the Bible. These are the last words of Genesis. I'm going to read it to you. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. So, you get that? Their father is dead now, and now they think that Joseph is going to pay them back. They know that they deserve it, and they're worried that Joseph only kept them alive because of their father. And so they lied. They lied. They made up a story that their father asked for Joseph to protect them. And Joseph cries. It doesn't exactly say why Joseph cried. Maybe you can imagine why Joseph cried. And then it says the brothers came down and threw themselves down before him and said, "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. You see how Joseph reframed the story. It's a lesson for us, and it can help us understand what happens to us at different stages in our lives. He says, God intended it for good. What you did to me was bad. He doesn't let them off the hook. He doesn't say, it never happened. He says, you intended to harm me. He acknowledges that. But he also said it had it in, what happened, the outcome, was a miracle. You're saved now. You're free from the famine because I'm here. I couldn't be here if you hadn't done what you did. So he reframed what had happened. He turned it into a positive. Now, I don't know that all of us can do that. I don't know if all of us have the ability to reframe our lives. I heard, just the other day, I heard Anderson Cooper talk about the pain that he lived through with his brother's suicide and losing his father at a very young age. And he talked about reframing. He just wrote a book about his life and understanding his life now as he teaches his son. He teaches his next generations his life and what you take from that life, a life that's been filled with pain. And he says, I've reframed it. I'm still in the process of reframing it. And I thought to myself, this is what we have the power to do. Not to forget, but to understand the people who've caused us harm in some cases, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, and look at it in a different way. Remember something. Joseph, in the moment that they came to him, had the power to wipe them off the face of the earth. There's literally nobody who would stand in his way to say, these 70 people, my brothers and their families, I make them disappear and no one says anything. These are the Egyptians. These are people who would go on to murder thousands, hundreds of thousands of us, potentially, of Jews. They don't care. These 50 or so people, we wipe them out. No one ever knows. They're all gone, like they never existed. No one cries. There's not a moment. They're done. We're done. Because every one of us wouldn't be here today. If Joseph had decided to exact vengeance on his brothers, you and I wouldn't be here. So that's the power of forgiveness. But it also tells us a very interesting thing about when you have been forgiven. Because it also teaches us that when someone has given us forgiveness, we may still not believe we've been forgiven. Because the brothers still have to tell this story. They still have to lie because they're worried that they haven't been forgiven. Which reminds us that sometimes, even after we've been given forgiveness, when we've asked for forgiveness and the people say they've forgiven us, that we still don't believe it. The message of Genesis, the last words of Genesis, are forgiveness. I would say the whole book is about forgiveness because it begins with a brother killing another brother, and it ends with a brother forgiving all of his brothers. And so we can survive. Humanity survives. Because humanity can't survive without forgiveness. We can't survive without forgiveness. Last night, the issue at hand with Garcia, and as I shared about the Holocaust, is one that causes us tremendous pain. And one of the great Jewish leaders of the last century, as somebody who we've already sang his melodies today, we've sing his melodies almost at every service, is Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach. And Rabbi Carlebach was born in the 1920s in Germany, in Berlin. And his family, his father and his brothers, his immediate family escaped to America, came to New York, and he spent his time growing up in New York. He always had a German accent because he spoke Yiddish for about the first 25 years of his life. and German. But Karlbach played all over the world. He sang and he had concerts, and they weren't really concerts. They were little services, little times for people to sing with him, and he'd tell stories. And in his life, he went to Germany many times. And a lot of people in the Jewish community said, how can you go to Germany? They murdered your family. Your whole trajectory of your life was different because of the Nazis. And he said, listen, if I had two hearts, I devote one heart, nonstop, 24 hours a day, to hating the Nazis. But God gave me one heart. And I choose to love with that heart. So, think about the forgiveness that survivors can give to the perpetrators of death. I thought about that with Margot Webb, our member of our community, who wrote a book about this, Tears in the Eyes of My Enemy, which we have at the temple. If you want to purchase the book, she's donating the proceeds of the book to our community and to Ukraine, to the families of Ukraine that are now dealing with, in the midst of the bloodshed. And so Margot wrote about her experiences going back to Germany. She was born there. She had literally, as she was leaving, her family was rounded up, and she only got to come to the country because her grandparents gave up their visas to her parents so that they could survive. And so her grandparents were murdered. And so when she went back, she wrote about her experiences, and the experiences are recounted in her book, and it was the last book that she's written. And I encouraged her to write the book because I wanted people to know of her story, of her ability to forgive, because she's my friend, but I also know as a human being that she has the potential, and that each of us has the potential to forgive, even the most horrific acts. But we don't want to a lot of times, even for things that aren't as serious, as difficult. And I've thought a lot about it, and I thought about it last night. And I want to say that regardless of whether people want to forgive Mike Garcia or whoever else has hurt you over the last year, I want to tell you that when you keep your resentment, when you keep your anger as a treasure that you don't want to let go of, you feel like maybe it's all you have, it's actually a reflection of weakness, of our own lack of self-esteem, our own feelings of inadequacy. Because these resentments, these grudges are a weight. And this is our baggage. It's interesting because the person who's hurt us oftentimes doesn't even know that we're carrying this baggage. They don't care. Even if they did care, they may not know. But for something to be a treasure, it has to have value. And I'll tell you that our resentments, our angers, our grudges, they're not transferable. They have no value. Because nobody else wants them. For something to have value, somebody has to want it. It's not transferable, even to our kids. We want our kids to have our resentments. We actually take pride when our kids dislike the same things that we dislike. I know I love to hear my kids speak ill will of the Packers. I mean, you get some pride out of that, but it's really silly because the things that really do count, when we try to have our children carry these grudges that are intergenerational, it's like a rock. And I think of these resentments like we become like Gollum from the Lord of the Rings. It's our precious. And we become so twisted. Some of us carry a big rock. Some of us carry a whole bunch of little or medium-sized rocks, but they're very heavy. They add up. Do I have to tell you how many people are willing to carry a grudge forever because they weren't put at the right table at a family wedding? Or how many people were insulted because you forgot to write them a thank you note for the recycled birthday gift that you sent them 3 months after their birthday? Do I have to tell you how many family members have become mortal enemies because they have a different recollection of who called whom last and whose turn it is to call next? We can't survive without forgiveness. We can't carry these resentments forever. And we ask God to forgive us, and God does. We read yesterday in our Torah study class about Elijah, who is told by God to go and to tell King Ahab that he was very bad. And he was very bad. And Elijah does tell Ahab, he holds him accountable, as the prophets do. And Ahab makes repentance. It was a perfect thing for us to read yesterday in our Tuesday morning class. And Elijah didn't want to do it. He didn't want Ahab to ask for forgiveness, to repent, and he does. And so God says to Elijah, look, Ahab repented. I'm not going to punish him. We'll defer it to the next generation, see what they do. So God does. And guess what? Later today, in a few hours when we read the story of Jonah, it's exactly the same situation. Jonah wanted the Assyrians to be punished so bad that he refuses to go on the mission. God says, go to Nineveh, tell them to repent. He goes, I don't want to. He just doesn't go. He's willing to die rather than watch these people repent, rather than allow them off the hook. He wants to die rather than give up his resentment. There's a midrash that Jonah's father was killed by the Assyrians, and that's why he hated them so much. It's an interesting story, interesting backstory. We don't really know about Jonah's family, but he didn't have to. He didn't have to have a backstory. He just, like Israelites, hated the Ninevites. They kept attacking us. Assyria kept hitting us, so it was natural. But we read the story of Jonah, we read the story of Elijah, and we read these stories. Moses, at one point, doesn't want to forgive the Israelites. We read these stories because we're reminded that the greatest religious leaders in the Torah, they don't want to give up their resentments. So it's not easy. And so today on Yom Kippur, as we think about forgiveness, I'm going to ask you to do three things. I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to ask myself to do these three things. If you've hurt someone during the past year, whether it was with your fist or with your tongue, with a clever put down or a lie, tell them what you've done. Go to them and tell them what you did. And say you're sorry. And I know it's not easy to do, but it's really important. Otherwise, you cannot really observe this Day of Atonement and ask God to forgive you. And the second thing that I ask of you and of myself is that if someone comes to you and says they're sorry and asks for forgiveness for something they've done to you, give it to them. For otherwise, how can we enter the Day of Atonement and ask God to forgive us if we're not willing to forgive others? I know it's not an easy thing to do, but it's important. And the third thing that I'm going to ask you to do, and ask of myself, is to let go of the baggage that you're carrying. for the apology that may not be coming, or it can never come. The grudges and resentments that are weighing you down and preventing you from living the life that you deserve to live. Let it go. Let it go. Let it go. Oh, let it go. And so let us ask for forgiveness and let us grant forgiveness on this Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, so that we can enter this new year cleansed of anger, purified of guilt, and free of baggage, and ready to ask God to treat us as we've treated others. May we all be sealed in the book of life, happiness, and good health that has just begun. Gamar Chatima Tova.